The golden chandeliers cast a warm glow across the polished marble floors of Bella Vista, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Every detail in this place screamed luxury, from the hand-carved wooden panels on the walls to the fresh orchids on each table. Everything was perfect. The kind of perfect that came with a price tag most people couldn't even imagine. Tonight was especially busy. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and the gentle clinking of expensive silverware against fine china. Men in $1,000 suits sat across from women draped in designer dresses, discussing deals that could change entire companies overnight. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was where power met power, where fortunes were made and lost over. 7-course meals. At the center of it all stood a magnificent grand piano. The black Steinway gleamed under the soft lighting, its surface so polished you could see your reflection in it. It wasn't just decoration. This piano was worth more than most people's houses. But tonight, like most nights, it sat silent. A beautiful sleeping giant waiting for the right hands to wake it up. Richard Stone sat at the best table in the house, right by the large windows overlooking Central Park. At 45, he was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. His sharp gray suit was tailored to perfection, and his steel blue eyes had a coldness that made people uncomfortable. Richard was the CEO of Nextech Solutions, a company he'd built from nothing into a billion-dollar empire. He was ruthless in business, and even more ruthless with people he considered beneath him. Tonight was important for Richard. Sitting around his table were 5 potential investors, each worth hundreds of millions of dollars. These weren't just any investors. These were the people who could take his company to the next level. The deal they were discussing could make Richard one of the richest men in America. But these investors were careful with their money. They wanted to see that Richard was someone they could trust, someone who shared their values. The market is ready for this kind of innovation, Richard was saying, cutting into his perfectly prepared steak. We're not just selling technology, we're selling the future. The investors nodded, impressed by his confidence. One of them, an older woman with silver hair, leaned forward. Your projections are impressive, Richard. But we need to know you. Understand the importance of image. In today's world, how you present yourself matters as much as your product. Richard smiled that cold smile of his. I completely understand. Image is everything. People need to know they're dealing with quality, with class. That's why I chose this restaurant tonight. Only the best will do. As the conversation continued, the staff moved around them like shadows. The servers at Bella Vista were trained to be invisible unless needed. They appeared when glasses needed refilling, disappeared when private conversations required privacy. It was an art form, and the staff had perfected it over years of serving the city's elite. Among them was Rosa Martinez, a woman who had been working at Bella Vista for 15 long years. At 52, Rosa had seen everything this restaurant had to offer. She'd served movie stars, politicians, and business tycoons. She'd watched deals worth billions of dollars get made over dessert and seen marriages end before the main course arrived. Rosa wasn't like the other servers. While most of them were young, aspiring actors or models working to pay their bills, Rosa was here for a different reason. She had a family to support. Her husband had died in a construction accident 8 years ago, leaving her to raise her teenage nephew and take care of her elderly mother. This job wasn't temporary for Rosa. It was survival. She moved between the tables with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp and professional. Rosa took pride in her work, even when customers treated her like furniture. She knew how to smile when people were rude, how to stay calm when they raised their voices, and how to make them feel important even when they made her feel small. Tonight, Rosa was assigned to Richard's section. She'd served him before and knew exactly what to expect. He was demanding, impatient, and treated the staff like they were invisible. He never said please or thank you, never looked her in the eye when he spoke, and always complained about something. But his tips were good, and Rosa needed every dollar she could get. As she approached his table with a new bottle of wine, Rosa could hear Richard talking about maintaining standards and keeping the right kind of people in the right places. She'd heard this kind of talk before from customers like him. They spoke in code, but the message was always clear. There were people who belonged in places like this, and people who didn't. The restaurant's manager, Tony Castellano, watched everything from his post near the kitchen. Tony had been running Bella Vista for over 20 years, and he knew how to handle difficult customers. He also knew how valuable Rosa was to his team. She was reliable, professional, and could handle any situation. But Tony also knew that customers like Richard Stone expected a certain level of accommodation. It was a delicate balance he had to maintain every night. The evening was going smoothly. Richard's presentation was impressing the investors, the food was perfect, and the atmosphere was exactly what everyone expected from Bella Vista. The soft murmur of conversations mixed with the gentle sounds of classical music playing through hidden speakers. Everything was under control, but life has a way of changing in an instant. Sometimes all it takes is one small moment, one unexpected event, to turn a perfect evening into something no one saw coming. Tonight, that moment was walking through the front door of Bella Vista. Completely unaware of the storm that was about to unfold, the restaurant continued its elegant dance. Servers glided between tables, glasses were refilled, and money changed hands in quiet conversations. The piano sat silent in its corner, beautiful and untouched. None of the diners paid it much attention. To them, it was just another expensive decoration in a room full of expensive things, but some people see beauty differently. Some people understand that true value isn't always about price tags or exclusivity. Sometimes the most precious things in life are the ones that speak to the soul, that remind us of our humanity in a world that often forgets it. Tonight, Bella Vista was about to learn that lesson in a way none of them would ever forget. The glass doors of Bella Vista opened with a soft whoosh, letting in a brief gust of cool evening air from the busy Manhattan street. A young man stepped inside, pausing for a moment as his eyes adjusted to the warm golden lighting. At 16, Alex Martinez had the kind of face that made people look twice. Not because he was particularly handsome, though he had his Aunt Rosa's kind eyes and warm smile. People noticed Alex because there was something different about him. Something that suggested depth beyond his years. Alex wasn't supposed to be here, not really. Kids his age didn't usually walk into places like Bella Vista unless they were with their wealthy parents. But Alex had a reason, the same reason he came here every Tuesday evening at exactly 8:30. He was here to walk his Aunt Rosa home after her shift ended. It had started 3 months ago, after a woman was attacked just 2 blocks from the restaurant. Rosa had called Alex that night, her voice shaking as she told him what happened. Fine, Mio, she had said, using the Spanish nickname she'd called him since he was little. But I was so scared walking to the subway alone. The next Tuesday, Alex showed up at Bella Vista without being asked. I'm walking you home, Tia Rosa, he had said simply. And I'm going to do it every week, Rosa had protested at first. Alex worked part-time at a grocery store after school, and Tuesday was usually his longest day. But Alex wouldn't hear any arguments. Family was family, and Rosa had sacrificed too much for him over the years. Tonight, Alex was running a few minutes late. His shift at the grocery store had gone longer than expected when a delivery truck arrived just as he was supposed to leave. Mr. Peterson, the store owner, was a good man who understood that Alex needed to leave on time on Tuesdays. But sometimes business just got in the way. Alex checked his phone as he stepped into the restaurant's elegant lobby. 8:35. Rosa would be finishing up with her last table soon. He'd learned the rhythm of her work over the past few months. Tuesday nights were usually busy but not crazy, which meant Rosa could wrap up her section by 9 o'clock. If everything went smoothly, the hostess at the front desk looked up as Alex approached. Jennifer had gotten used to seeing him over the past few months. At first, she'd been suspicious. Teenagers didn't usually hang around expensive restaurants unless they were up to something. But Alex was different. He was polite, quiet, and clearly just there for his aunt. Hey, Alex, Jennifer said with a genuine smile. Rosa's almost done. She's just finishing up with the big table by the windows. You can wait in your usual spot. Alex nodded his thanks and made his way to a small area near the bar where extra chairs were tucked away. It wasn't much of a waiting area, but it was out of the way of the servers and customers. He'd claimed this little corner as his own over the past few months, and the staff had gotten used to seeing him there with his backpack and homework, but tonight was different. As Alex settled into his usual chair and pulled out his history textbook, something caught his eye: the piano. It sat there in its corner like it always did, but tonight the light seemed to hit it differently. Maybe it was the way the chandelier above cast shadows across its polished surface, or maybe Alex was just seeing it with fresh eyes after a long day. Alex had noticed the piano before, of course. It was impossible to miss. But he'd always been careful to keep his distance. He knew the rules of places like this, even without being told. Look, but don't touch. Be grateful you're allowed inside at all. Don't draw attention to yourself. Tonight, though, something was pulling him toward that beautiful instrument. Alex had been playing piano since he was 7 years old, starting on an old electric keyboard his Aunt Rosa had bought him from a pawn shop for his birthday. It had half the keys missing and speakers that crackled when you played too loudly, but to 7-year-old Alex, it might as well have been a Steinway. Over the years, Alex had gotten good, really good. He'd taught himself mostly using YouTube, videos and library books when Rosa couldn't afford lessons. When his music teacher at school noticed his talent, she'd started staying after hours to work with him for free. "You have a gift, Alex," she would tell him. "Don't waste it." Alex didn't waste it. Every spare moment he had, he was practicing. At school, during lunch breaks, at the community center on weekends, even on the old upright piano at their church. When Father Rodriguez would let him in early on Sunday mornings. Music wasn't just a hobby for Alex, it was his escape, his passion, his future, but Alex had never played a real grand piano. He'd seen them in videos, read about them in books, dreamed about what it would feel like to sit at one. The piano at Bella Vista was everything he'd imagined and more. Even from across the room, he could see the perfection of its construction, the way the light reflected off its pristine surface. As Alex tried to focus on his homework, his eyes kept drifting back to the piano. He could imagine what it would sound like, how the keys would feel under his fingers. He'd been working on a piece by Chopin for months now, struggling with some of the more complex passages on the community center's old upright, with its sticky keys and uneven tone. On a piano like that one, the music would flow like water. The restaurant was starting to quiet down as the evening moved toward closing time. Most of the dinner crowd had finished their meals and moved on to other parts of their evening. The investors at Richard Stone's table were still deep in conversation, but their voices had grown softer, more intimate. This was when the real deals got made, when handshakes worth millions of dollars happened over the last sips of expensive wine. Alex glanced at his phone again. 8:50, Rosa should be wrapping up soon. He looked around the dining room and spotted her across the room, clearing plates from a table that had just left. She moved with the same efficient grace she always had, but Alex could see the tiredness in her shoulders. 15 years of this work had taken its toll, though Rosa never complained. Watching his aunt work always filled Alex with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because Rosa was the hardest working person he knew, someone who had sacrificed her own dreams to take care of family. Sadness because Alex knew Rosa had once had dreams of her own. She'd wanted to be a teacher before life got in the way. Before responsibility became more important than ambition. Alex was going to be different. He was going to make something of himself. Not just for him, but for Rosa. Every scholarship application he filled out, every audition he prepared for, every hour he spent practicing was for both of them. Music was going to be their way out of the struggle, their path to a better life. The piano seemed to call to him again. And this time Alex found himself standing up without really deciding to. His feet carried him across the restaurant floor, past the empty tables and dimmed lights. He told himself he was just going to look, just going to see it up close. There was no harm in that, right? As he got closer, Alex could see every detail of the magnificent instrument. The wood grain was perfect, the brass pedals polished to a mirror shine. This wasn't just a piano. This was a work of art, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that represented centuries of musical tradition. Alex reached the piano and stopped, his heart beating a little faster. Up close, it was even more beautiful than he'd imagined. He could see his reflection in its glossy surface, could almost hear the music waiting inside it. All those keys, all those possibilities. A lifetime of songs waiting to be played. Without really thinking about it, Alex reached out and gently touched one of the keys. Middle C, the note rang out clear and pure, perfect in a way that took his breath away. It was just one note, but it was the most beautiful sound he'd heard in months. What Alex didn't know was that across the room, sharp eyes had noticed his movement toward the piano. What he didn't know was that his simple, innocent gesture was about to change everything. The single note from the piano hung in the air for just a moment before fading away. To Alex, it was the most beautiful sound he'd heard all day. To Richard Stone, sitting 40 feet away at his important dinner table, it was like a fire alarm. Going off, Richard's head snapped up from his conversation about quarterly projections and market expansion. His steel blue eyes immediately found the source of the sound. There, standing at his precious piano, was a teenager. Not just any teenager, but one who clearly didn't belong in a place like Bella Vista. Richard could tell just by looking at him. The boy was wearing jeans and a simple hoodie, probably from some discount store. His backpack was thrown over one shoulder, and he had that look that Richard associated with trouble. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard's voice cut through the restaurant's quiet atmosphere like a knife. The words came out louder than he'd intended, but he didn't care. Every head in the dining room turned toward the sound. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft background music seemed to pause. Alex jerked his hand back from the piano as if it had burned him. His heart immediately started racing, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden attention. He turned toward the voice and saw a man in an expensive suit striding toward him, his face twisted with anger. "I'm sorry, sir," Alex said quickly, his voice quiet but steady. "I was just what?" Richard interrupted, his voice getting louder with each step. "Just touching a piano that costs more than your family makes in 5 years? Just putting your grubby hands on something you have no business being near?" The investors at Richard's table watched with interest. This wasn't what they'd expected from their business dinner, but it was certainly entertaining. They could see their potential partner in action now, see how he handled situations when he was in control. Alex felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he kept his voice respectful. "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, sir. I was just waiting for my aunt to finish work." "Your aunt?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess. One of the cleaning ladies? The kitchen staff?" His eyes scanned Alex from head to toe, taking in every detail of his appearance. "I should have known. You people always think you can just wander around wherever you want." Those words hit Alex like a physical blow. "You people." He'd heard phrases like that before, usually whispered behind closed doors or muttered under people's breath, but never thrown at him so directly, so publicly. Alex felt something twist in his stomach, a mixture of hurt and anger that he worked hard to keep off his face. Rosa had been collecting payment from a table near the kitchen when she heard Richard's raised voice. At first, she thought it was just another demanding customer complaining about his meal. But when she heard the word aunt, her blood ran cold. She turned toward the sound and saw exactly what she'd feared most. Her nephew Alex was standing by the piano, and Richard Stone was bearing down on him like a predator. Rosa dropped what she was doing and hurried across the restaurant floor, her heart pounding. She'd served Richard Stone dozens of times over the years, and she knew exactly what kind of man he was. He was the type who looked right through people like her, who treated the staff like they were invisible unless something went wrong, and when something did go wrong, he could be vicious. "Alex, what are you doing here so early?" Rosa said as she reached them, trying to inject some lightness into her voice. But she could see the tension in her nephew's shoulders, could see the anger building in Richard's face. "Ah, there she is," Richard said, turning his attention to Rosa. "I should have known." Can't control your family any better than you can remember to refill my water glass on time? Rosa felt the familiar sting of his words, but she was more worried about Alex than herself. I'm so sorry, Mr. Stone. Alex was just waiting for me to finish my shift. He walks me home on Tuesday nights for safety. Safety? Richard's laugh was harsh. Maybe you should be more worried about the safety of my other customers. What's next? Is he going to start going through purses while we're distracted by his piano performance? The suggestion was so ridiculous, so insulting that Alex couldn't stay quiet anymore. I would never do anything like that, he said, his voice stronger now despite the hurt in his eyes. I was just looking at the piano. I've never seen one so beautiful. Beautiful? Richard's voice dripped with sarcasm. What would you know about beauty, about quality? This piano is worth more than you'll make in your entire life, assuming you ever manage to find a real job. Several other diners had started pulling out their phones now. Some were recording video, others were just taking pictures. The scene was too dramatic to ignore, and in today's world, everything interesting ended up on social media within minutes. Tony Castellano, the restaurant manager, appeared as if from nowhere. He'd been watching the situation unfold from across the room, trying to decide when to intervene. Tony had been in the restaurant business long enough to know that situations like this could go bad quickly. Is there a problem here, Mr. Stone? Tony asked, his voice carefully neutral. He needed to protect his staff, but he also couldn't afford to offend one of his most important customers. The problem, Richard said, turning to Tony with obvious irritation, is that you're letting random kids wander around my restaurant touching expensive equipment. What kind of establishment are you running here? Tony felt the weight of the situation. He looked at Alex, who was standing quietly with his hands at his sides, clearly embarrassed but not backing down. Then he looked at Rosa, who had been one of his best employees for 15 years. Finally, he looked at Richard Stone, whose business dinners brought thousands of dollars to the restaurant every month. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding, Tony said carefully. The young man wasn't causing any harm. Wasn't causing any harm? Richard's voice rose again. He was touching a priceless instrument with his dirty hands. Who knows what kind of damage he might have done? Who knows what he might have been planning to do next? Alex felt something inside him snap. Not into anger, but into a kind of clarity. He'd spent his whole life being polite, being respectful, staying in his place. But there was something about this moment, about the way this man was talking about him and his family, that made him want to stand up for himself. My hands aren't dirty, sir, Alex said quietly. And I wasn't planning to do anything except wait for my aunt. I love music, and I've never seen such a beautiful piano before. Sorry if I shouldn't have touched it, but I meant no disrespect. Richard stared at Alex for a moment, surprised by the teenager's composure. Most kids would have been running for the door by now, or at least cowering under his verbal assault. But this boy was standing his ground, speaking respectfully, but firmly. It actually made Richard even more angry. Love music? Richard said with a sneer. Right, I'm sure you're a real Mozart. Let me tell you something, kid. This isn't your world. These aren't your people. This piano, this restaurant, the people in it, none of this is for you. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. The words hung in the air like poison. Around the dining room, other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were clearly enjoying the drama, but others looked disturbed by Richard's harsh words. The staff had stopped what they were doing to watch. Unsure whether to intervene or stay out of the way, Rosa felt tears prick at her eyes, not for herself, but for Alex. She'd worked so hard to shield him from this kind of treatment, to make sure he grew up believing he could be anything he wanted to be. And now this man was trying to tear all of that down in front of a room full of strangers? Please, Mr. Stone, Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's just a boy. He meant no harm, but Richard wasn't finished. He could see the phones recording, could see the attention he was getting from his investors. This was his chance to show them what kind of leader he was, how he handled problems when they arose. Just a boy? Richard said, his voice carrying across the entire restaurant now. This boy needs to learn some respect. Needs to learn his place. Maybe it's time someone taught him exactly where he belongs. Alex looked around the room at all the faces staring at him. Some looked curious, some looked uncomfortable, and a few looked genuinely sympathetic. But they were all watching, all waiting to see what would happen next. He thought about running, about grabbing Rosa's hand and walking out of there as fast as possible, but something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that running away wouldn't change anything. Men like Richard Stone would still exist tomorrow, would still treat people like Rosa and Alex as if they didn't matter. Running away wouldn't prove anything except that Richard was right. So Alex stayed. He stood there with his head held high, looking Richard Stone straight in the eye, and waited to see what would happen next. Richard Stone felt the eyes of everyone in the restaurant on him, and he liked it. This was his moment to show everyone what real leadership looked like, how a successful man handled problems when they arose. The investors at his table were watching with interest, and he could see approval in some of their faces. This was exactly the kind of decisive action they wanted to see from a potential business partner. "Tony," Richard called out to the manager, his voice carrying a tone of authority that expected immediate obedience. "I want security called right now. This situation has gone too far." Tony Castellano felt his stomach drop. Security meant involving the police, and once the police were involved, everything would become official. There would be reports, questions, and probably bad publicity for the restaurant. But Richard Stone spent more money at Bella Vista in a month than most customers spent in a year. "Mr. Stone, I really don't think that's necessary," Tony said, trying to keep his voice calm and professional. "The young man hasn't done anything that requires? Hasn't done anything?" Richard's voice rose to a level that made several diners at nearby tables shift uncomfortably. "He's trespassing. He's damaging private property. He's disturbing my guests and ruining my business dinner. If that's not enough for you to take action, then maybe I need to find a restaurant with management that actually cares about protecting its customers." The threat was clear. Tony had seen Richard destroy business relationships over smaller things than this. If he lost Richard's business, the restaurant would feel it immediately. But looking at Alex and Rosa, Tony also knew he was being asked to choose between money and what was right. Alex watched the manager's face and could see the internal struggle happening there. He felt bad for putting Tony in this position. Alex had never wanted any of this attention, never wanted to cause problems for anyone. He just wanted to wait for his aunt and walk her home safely, like he did every Tuesday. "Sir," Alex said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, "I can just leave. I don't want to cause any more trouble." "Oh, you'll leave all right," Richard said, pointing a finger at Alex like a weapon. "But not before everyone here understands exactly what happened tonight. Not before there are consequences for this kind of behavior." Rosa felt helpless as she watched her nephew being treated like a criminal. 15 years of working in places like this had taught her when to speak up and when to stay quiet, but this was Alex. This was her family. She couldn't just stand there and watch him be humiliated. "Please, Mr. Stone," Rosa said, stepping closer to her nephew. "Alex is a good boy. He's never been in trouble, never caused problems for anyone. He works hard in school, he has a job, he helps take care of our family. This is just a misunderstanding." Richard turned his cold stare on Rosa, and she could see the contempt in his eyes. "A misunderstanding? Your nephew just contaminated a $50,000 piano with his hands. Do you have any idea what it costs to have an instrument like that professionally cleaned and tuned?" The number hit Rosa like a physical blow. $50,000. That was more than she made in 2 years of working at the restaurant. The thought that Alex might have somehow damaged something so valuable made her feel sick. "I barely touched it," Alex said quietly. "I just pressed one key, very gently. I would never damage anything on purpose." "One key?" Richard laughed, but the sound was harsh and ugly. "Do you think that matters? Do you think your germs know to stay on just one key? Do you think the oils from your skin only affect the note you touched? Several diners had their phones out now, recording everything. Some were trying to be subtle about it, holding their phones low or pretending to check messages. Others were, more obvious, clearly capturing video of the confrontation. The scene was too dramatic to ignore, and everyone seemed to sense that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a long time. One of the investors at Richard's table, a man with silver hair and an expensive watch, leaned over to whisper something to the woman sitting next to him. She nodded and whispered back, both of them keeping their eyes on the scene unfolding near the piano. They were clearly evaluating not just the situation, but how Richard was handling it. "You know what the real problem is here?" Richard continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "It's that some people don't understand boundaries. Don't understand that there are places where they belong and places where they don't. Don't understand that respect has to be earned, not just demanded." Alex felt each word like a slap. He'd heard this kind of talk before, but never directed at him so publicly, so viciously. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to explain that he did understand respect, that he'd been nothing but respectful since the moment he walked into the restaurant. But another part of him was beginning to understand that nothing he said would matter to this man. "I think what Mr. Stone is trying to say," Tony said, attempting to mediate, "is that the piano is a very valuable piece of equipment and we need to be careful about—" "Don't try to soften this, Tony," Richard cut him off. "I'm not trying to say anything, I'm saying it directly. This kid doesn't belong here, his family doesn't belong here. And the fact that you're letting them think they do is a problem for your business." Rosa felt tears building in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let someone like Richard Stone make her feel ashamed of who she was or where she came from. A woman at a table near the window stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. She was older, probably in her 60s, with the kind of jewelry that suggested serious money. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through Richard's tirade, "but this has gone quite far enough." Richard turned toward her, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "I'm sorry, but this doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," the woman said, walking closer to the group near the piano. "You see, I've been coming to this restaurant for 20 years. I've watched this young lady," she gestured toward Rosa, "serve customers with grace and professionalism night after night. And I've watched you treat her and other staff members like they're invisible, unless you need something to complain about." The woman's words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's face flushed red, partly from anger and partly from embarrassment. He wasn't used to being called out publicly, especially not by someone who clearly had money and social standing. "This is a private matter," Richard said through gritted teeth. "Private?" The woman looked around the restaurant at all the phones recording, at all the faces watching. "Nothing about this seems private to me. And frankly, your behavior is more disturbing than anything this young man has done." Other diners began murmuring among themselves. Some were clearly on Richard's side, agreeing that the boy had been out of line. But others seemed uncomfortable with how the situation was being handled. The recording phones captured everything. Every word, every expression, every uncomfortable moment. Alex looked around the room and realized that this moment would probably follow him for a long time. In a few hours, videos of this confrontation would be online. People would share them, comment on them, judge everyone involved. His name would be attached to this forever, but instead of making him want to run away, the thought made him stand up straighter. If this was going to follow him, if people were going to judge him based on this moment, then he wanted to make sure they saw who he really was. "Mr. Stone," Alex said, his voice clear and strong enough to carry across the restaurant, "I understand that you're upset. I understand that this piano is valuable and that you think I shouldn't have touched it. But I want you to know something about me." Richard stared at him, surprised by the teenager's sudden confidence. "I'm not the person you think I am," Alex continued. "I'm not here to cause trouble or to take anything that doesn't belong to me. I'm here because I love my family and I want to make sure my aunt gets home safely, that's all." The restaurant had gone completely quiet now. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. Everyone was listening, waiting to see what would happen next. Richard looked around the room at all the faces watching him, at all the phones recording. He could feel the moment slipping away from him, could sense that the narrative was changing. But he wasn't about to let a teenager embarrass him in front of his investors and potential business partners. You want to know what I think? Richard sighed, a cruel smile spreading across his face. I think it's time to put this whole situation to rest once and for all. Richard Stone looked around the restaurant, taking in all the watching faces, all the recording phones, all the attention focused on this moment. The older woman's words had stung more than he cared to admit. Some of the other diners were nodding, in agreement with her, and he could see disapproval in faces that should have been supporting him. This wasn't going the way he'd planned, but Richard hadn't become a billionaire by backing down when things got difficult. He'd built his empire by finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them, by turning their strengths against them. And suddenly, looking at this teenager who claimed to love music, Richard had an idea that made him smile. You know what? Richard said, his voice taking on a different tone. Less angry, but somehow more dangerous. I think I've been handling this all wrong. Here I am, getting upset about someone touching my piano, when maybe I should be more understanding. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. Something about Richard's sudden change in tone made him more nervous than the yelling had. Rosa must have felt it too, because she moved slightly closer to her nephew, as if trying to protect him from whatever was coming next. You said you love music, didn't you? Richard continued, his smile growing wider. You said you've never seen such a beautiful piano. Well, I'm a reasonable man. Maybe I was too quick to judge. Tony, the manager, looked confused. He'd known Richard for years, and this sudden shift from anger to apparent generosity didn't fit the man's personality at all. Something was coming, and Tony had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. In fact, Richard said, walking closer to the piano, I'm feeling generous tonight. My investors here have been treated to dinner and conversation, but we haven't had any entertainment. And here you are, claiming to love music, standing right next to a beautiful piano. The pieces were starting to come together for Alex, and he didn't like where this was heading. But he stood his ground, meeting Richard's cold stare with as much dignity as he could manage. So here's what we're going to do, Richard announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent restaurant. Since you're so interested in this piano, since you apparently know so much about music, why don't you play something for us? The suggestion hit the room like a bomb. Several diners gasped audibly. Others leaned forward in their chairs, suddenly more interested in the drama unfolding before them. Everyone understood what was really happening here. This wasn't an invitation, it was a trap. Play something? Alex repeated quietly. That's right, Richard said, gesturing grandly toward the piano bench. Show everyone what you can do. Prove that you actually belong in the same room as an instrument like this. I mean, if you really love music as much as you claim, this should be easy for you, right? Rosa felt her heart break as she realized what Richard was doing. He was setting Alex up for public humiliation. He expected Alex to sit down at that piano and embarrass himself, to prove that he was just a kid from the wrong side of town who didn't belong in a place like Bella Vista. I don't think that's necessary, Rosa said quickly. Alex, we should just go. Your homework won't finish itself. But Richard wasn't about to let them leave now. Not when he had the perfect opportunity to teach everyone in the restaurant a lesson about knowing your place in the world. Oh, come on, Richard said, his voice dripping with false encouragement. Don't be modest. Your nephew here was so confident a few minutes ago. So sure that he understood music, so comfortable touching my piano. Surely he won't mind sharing his talents with all of us. The investors at Richard's table were watching with fascination. This was better than any business presentation. They were seeing their potential partner in action, watching how he handled problems and dealt with challenges. Several of them were clearly enjoying the show. What's the matter? Richard continued, sensing Alex's hesitation. Having second thoughts? starting to realize that there's a difference between loving music and actually being able to make music. Alex looked around the restaurant at all the expectant faces. Some people looked sympathetic, but others seemed eager to see him fail. The phones were still recording, capturing every moment of this humiliation. Whatever happened next would be preserved forever, shared across social media, commented on by strangers. But as Alex looked at the piano, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, but a kind of calm. This beautiful instrument that had started all the trouble was calling to him. He could almost hear the music waiting inside it, could feel the keys under his fingers even though he hadn't touched them yet. "I'll do it," Alex said quietly. Rosa grabbed his arm. "Alex, no. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I know I don't have to," Alex said, looking at his aunt with a small smile. "But I want to." Richard's grin widened. This was going exactly as he'd planned. In a few minutes, this kid would sit down at the piano and probably play something like Chopsticks or Mary Had a Little Lamb. Maybe he'd freeze up completely and not be able to play anything at all. Either way, it would prove Richard's point about people knowing their place. "Excellent," Richard said, clapping his hands together. "Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we're going to have some entertainment after all." The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as Alex walked toward the piano bench. His steps were steady, confident even. Rosa followed a few feet behind, her face pale with worry. She knew Alex could play, of course. She'd heard him practicing on that old keyboard at home countless times. But this was different. This was a trap, and she was terrified of what would happen when it was sprung. Alex stopped in front of the piano bench and looked down at the keys. They were perfect, ivory white and ebony black, arranged in the familiar pattern he'd known since childhood. But these keys were different from any he'd ever touched. They looked like they'd been carved from light itself. "Take your time," Richard said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sure our guests are eager to hear what you can do." Around the restaurant, people were pulling out their phones if they hadn't already. This was going to be one of those videos that everyone would be talking about tomorrow. A kid getting put in his place by a successful businessman? A lesson about reality and knowing where you belong in the world. Alex sat down on the bench and adjusted his position slightly. The bench was the perfect height, the piano the perfect distance from his body. Everything about this instrument was designed for music, built for the kind of performances that could move people to tears or lift their spirits to the heavens. He placed his hands gently on the keys, his fingers finding their natural positions. The touch was everything he'd dreamed it would be. Responsive but not too sensitive, firm but not stiff. This piano had been built by masters of their craft, and it showed in every detail. "Any requests?" Alex asked, looking up at Richard with innocent eyes. Richard's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected the kid to be more nervous, more obviously out of his depth. But Alex seemed comfortable, like he belonged at that piano bench. "Surprise us," Richard said, recovering his composure. "Play whatever you think is appropriate for a restaurant like this." Alex nodded and looked down at the keys again. For a moment, the restaurant was completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to have stopped. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment of silence, Alex made a choice. He could play something simple and safe, something that wouldn't embarrass him but wouldn't impress anyone either. Or he could play something that showed who he really was, something that proved that talent and passion didn't depend on where you came from or what you wore. Alex took a deep breath, positioned his fingers over the keys, and began to play. Alex's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the restaurant. But these weren't the hesitant, uncertain sounds Richard had expected to hear. These were the notes of a master, played with a precision, an emotion that made everyone in the room freeze. The opening melody was soft, almost whispered, but it carried a weight that seemed to pull everyone forward in their seats. Alex's left hand provided a gentle foundation while his right hand sang the main theme with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone so young. The piano responded to his touch like it had been waiting its whole life for these particular Hands, Richard's smug expression began to fade as the first few measures unfolded. This wasn't chopsticks. This wasn't even a simple classical piece that any music student might know. This was one of the most challenging pieces in the entire piano repertoire, and the kid was playing it like he'd been born to it around the restaurant. Phones that had been raised to record what everyone expected to be an embarrassing moment now captured something entirely different. The woman who had defended Alex earlier clasped her hands together, her eyes wide with amazement. The investors at Richard's table leaned forward, their business conversation completely forgotten. As Alex moved into the piece's first major section, his technique became even more apparent. His fingers moved across the keys with a speed and accuracy that would have impressed conservatory professors. But it wasn't just technical skill. There was something deeper happening here, something that spoke to the soul of everyone listening. The Chopin Ballade is a piece that tells a story without words, that paints pictures with sound. In Alex's hands, that story came alive. The gentle opening gave way to more passionate passages, moments where the music seemed to dance and play before diving into deeper, more emotional territory. Rosa stood frozen near the piano, tears streaming down her face. She'd heard Alex play many times at home, but never like this. The acoustics of the restaurant, the quality of the piano, and something about this moment had brought out something in his playing that she'd never heard before. This wasn't just her nephew playing music. This was art happening right in front of her. The piece continued to unfold, and Alex seemed to disappear into the music. His eyes were closed now, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Every note was perfectly placed, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical understanding that usually took decades to develop. The piano sang under his fingers, producing sound so beautiful that several diners had stopped eating entirely. Tony, the manager, stood by the kitchen door, his mouth slightly open. In 20 years of running Bella Vista, he'd hired professional pianists for special events. He'd hosted concerts and recitals, but he'd never heard anything like this. The kid wasn't just playing the piano. He was making it speak, making it tell stories that went straight to the heart. As the piece moved through its various sections, the mood in the restaurant shifted completely. What had started as an ugly confrontation had become something magical. The anger and tension that had filled the air just minutes before was replaced by wonder and admiration. Even the staff had stopped working to listen. Richard Stone sat at his table, his face growing paler with each passing minute. He'd expected to humiliate a teenager and prove a point about social class and knowing your place. Instead, he was watching that same teenager demonstrate a level of talent that most people could only dream of. The trap he'd set had become his own nightmare. The technical demands of the piece were enormous. Rapid runs up and down the keyboard, complex rhythms that required both hands to work independently, passages that demanded incredible strength and endurance. Alex handled all of it with an ease that suggested years of serious study and practice. His hands moved like they were dancing, never hesitating, never stumbling, but it was the emotional content of his playing that truly set him apart. This wasn't just a display of technical skill. Alex was interpreting the music, finding in Chopin's notes the story of his own life. The struggles, the dreams, the moments of doubt, and the flashes of hope. Every person in the restaurant could hear their own experiences reflected in the sound. One of Richard's investors, a man who had been in the music business before moving into tech, recognized what he was hearing. This wasn't just a talented amateur. This was someone who understood music at a level that suggested serious training and natural gifts that came along maybe once in a generation. As Alex approached the piece's most challenging section, a passage that many professional pianists found difficult, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The music built to incredible intensity, demanding lightning-fast fingerwork and perfect coordination between both hands. The notes came so quickly they almost seemed to blur together, creating a wall of sound that was both thrilling and beautiful. Alex navigated the passage flawlessly, his concentration absolute. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead from the physical demands of the piece, but his playing never wavered. If anything, he seemed to be gaining strength as the music continued, drawing energy from the piano itself. The older woman who had defended Alex earlier found herself crying. She'd been a music teacher for 40 years before retiring, and she recognized exceptional talent when she heard it. This young man wasn't just playing notes on a page. He was channeling something deeper, something that spoke to the very essence of what music could be. Even the restaurant's kitchen staff had gathered in the doorway to listen. Cooks and dishwashers who had never shown interest in classical music found themselves captivated by what they were hearing. There was something universal about Alex's playing, something that transcended musical training or cultural background. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Alex opened his eyes and looked out at his audience for the first time since he'd started playing. What he saw surprised him. Every face in the restaurant was fixed on him with an expression of amazement and respect. People who had been judging him moments before were now looking at him like he was something precious and rare. The final passages of the ballade are among the most beautiful in all of classical music. Chopin wrote them as a kind of musical farewell, a gentle conclusion to the storm of emotions that had come before. In Alex's hands, these final notes took on an almost spiritual quality, as if the music was blessing everyone who heard it. Richard watched in growing horror as his carefully planned humiliation turned into a triumph for the teenager he'd tried to destroy. Every note Alex played made Richard look smaller, meaner, more foolish. The investors who were supposed to be impressed by Richard's handling of the situation were now completely focused on the young musician. As Alex played the final chord, letting it ring out until the sound faded completely into silence, the restaurant remained frozen for a long moment. No one seemed to want to break the spell that had been cast by the music. The silence stretched on, filled with the lingering beauty of what they had just witnessed. Then, as if a dam had burst, the applause began. The applause started slowly, with the older woman who had defended Alex earlier. Her clapping was soft at first, almost reverent, as if she was afraid to disturb the beautiful silence that followed his performance. But within seconds, others joined in, and the sound grew until it filled every corner of the restaurant. Alex sat at the piano bench, breathing heavily from the intensity of his performance. His hands were still resting on the keys, and he looked almost surprised by the response. He'd been so lost in the music that he'd forgotten where he was, forgotten the confrontation that had led to this moment. For those few minutes, there had been nothing in the world except him, the piano, and Chopin's incredible music. Richard Stone remained frozen in his chair, his face pale and his mouth slightly open. The trap he'd set had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of humiliating a teenager who didn't know his place, he'd just witnessed one of the most impressive musical performances he'd ever heard. And everyone in the restaurant had seen it happen. The applause continued, growing louder and more enthusiastic. People were standing now, giving Alex a standing ovation that seemed to surprise him more than anyone. He looked around the room with wide eyes, taking in the faces that had been hostile or indifferent just minutes before and were now filled with admiration and respect. "That was incredible," someone called out from across the restaurant. "Absolutely incredible." Rosa wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her nephew receive the recognition he deserved. She'd always known Alex was special, but seeing him perform in front of all these people, seeing their reaction to his talent, filled her with a pride that was almost overwhelming. One of the investors at Richard's table, a woman with silver hair and expensive jewelry, stood up and walked toward the piano. She was smiling broadly and her eyes were bright with excitement. "Young man," she said to Alex, "that was one of the most beautiful performances I've heard in years. Where did you learn to play like that?" Alex looked to his Aunt Rosa, unsure how to answer. He'd spent most of his life being told not to brag about his abilities, not to draw attention to himself. But Rosa nodded encouragingly, giving him permission to share his story. "I've been playing since I was 7, Alex said quietly. "I started on an old keyboard my aunt bought me from a pawn shop." The woman's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Self-taught?" "Mostly," Alex admitted. "My music teacher at school helps me when she can, and I practice at the community center whenever they'll let me use their piano. Rosa stepped forward, unable to contain her pride any longer. Tell them about Juilliard, Mio, she said softly. The word Juilliard rippled through the crowd like electricity. Juilliard was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world, the kind of place that only the most talented musicians could even dream of attending. You're at Juilliard? The silver-haired woman asked, her voice filled with awe. Alex nodded, looking embarrassed by the attention. Just the pre-college program. On weekends, I got a scholarship. The revelation sent whispers through the restaurant. A scholarship to Juilliard's pre-college program was incredibly rare and competitive. Thousands of young musicians auditioned every year, and only a tiny fraction were accepted. To receive a scholarship meant Alex was among the most talented young pianists in the entire country? Tell them about the competitions, Rosa said, her voice stronger now. She was done being ashamed of their circumstances, done letting people like Richard Stone make her feel small. Her nephew was extraordinary, and it was time everyone knew it. Alex looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he continued, I've won a few competitions. The Young Artists Piano Competition last year, and the International Youth Music Festival the year before that. One of the men at Richard's table, who had been quiet during the confrontation, suddenly sat up straighter. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed something, his eyes widening as he read the results. Alexander Martinez, he said, looking up from his phone. You're Alexander Martinez. The Alexander Martinez who performed with the New York Philharmonic. Last spring, the restaurant fell silent again. Performing with the New York Philharmonic was the kind of achievement that most professional musicians could only dream of. For a 16-year-old to have that opportunity meant he was already being recognized as a major talent in the classical music world. You played Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, the man continued, still staring at his phone. The New York Times Review called your performance breathtaking and said you were a young artist to watch. Richard felt sick to his stomach. Not only had he attacked an innocent teenager, but he'd attacked one of the most promising young musicians in the country. Someone who had already achieved more in his 16 years than most people would in their entire lives. The videos that people had taken of the confrontation would make Richard look not just cruel, but foolish. Rosa's chest swelled with pride as she watched the faces around the restaurant change. These people who had looked at her nephew with suspicion and disdain were now seeing him for who he really was. Not just a kid from the wrong side of town, but a genuine artist, someone with a gift that transcended social class and economic status. The money he earns from his part-time job, Rosa said, her voice carrying clearly across the restaurant, doesn't just help our family. It pays for sheet music, for practice room rentals when the community center is closed, for travel to competitions and master classes. Every dollar he makes goes toward his music. The silver-haired woman looked at Alex with something approaching reverence. And you walk your aunt home from work every week? Every Tuesday, Alex confirmed. It's not safe for her to walk alone at night. The simple statement hit everyone in the restaurant like a physical blow. Here was a young man who could have been focusing entirely on his music, on his promising career, but instead he took time every week to make sure his aunt was safe. The contrast between his character and Richard's behavior couldn't have been more stark. One of the other diners, a middle-aged man in a business suit, stood up and started clapping again. That took real courage, he said, looking directly at Alex. Standing up to someone who was trying to humiliate you and then proving them wrong in the most elegant way possible. The applause started up again, even stronger than before. But this time it wasn't just for Alex's musical performance. It was for his dignity, his grace under pressure, his quiet strength in the face of cruelty. Richard looked around the table at his potential investors, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with disgust, with disappointment, with the kind of expression you might give to something unpleasant you'd found on the bottom of your shoe. You know, said one of the investors, a man who had been seriously considering putting millions into Richard's company, I think we need to reconsider our business relationship. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. In his attempt to prove his superiority and put a teenager in his place, he destroyed his own reputation and possibly his business future. The irony was bitter and complete. Tony, the manager, stepped forward, looking directly at Alex with newfound respect. "Mr. Martinez," he said formally, "it would be an honor to have you perform here any time you'd like. We would be happy to provide a platform for your incredible talent." Alex smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown since the confrontation began. "Thank you, but I think I prefer to keep my Tuesday evenings free. Family time is important." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet dignity, made several people in the restaurant tear up. Here was a young man who had every reason to be proud, every right to demand recognition and respect, but who remained humble and focused on what really mattered. As the evening continued, more and more people approached Alex and Rosa. Business cards were exchanged, opportunities were discussed, and connections were made. But through it all, Alex remained the same polite, respectful young man he'd been when he first walked into the restaurant. Richard Stone sat at his table, watching his world crumble around him, and realized that the most expensive lesson of his life had just been taught by a 16-year-old with a gift for music and a heart full of love for his family. The evening at Bella Vista ended very differently than anyone had expected. As Alex and Rosa prepared to leave, they were surrounded by people wanting to shake hands, exchange contact information, and express their admiration. Business cards were pressed into Alex's hands from music producers, talent agents, and even a representative from a major record label who happened to be dining at the restaurant. "This is my card," said the silver-haired woman who had first approached Alex after his performance. "I'm the director of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. We provide scholarships and support for young artists. I'd love to discuss some opportunities with you." Alex looked at the elegant business card, then up at the woman's kind face. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very generous." "No," she said firmly. "Thank you. What you did tonight reminded all of us why music matters, why art matters. You turned an ugly moment into something beautiful." Richard Stone sat alone at his table now. His investors had left one by one, each offering polite but clearly final excuses about why they wouldn't be moving forward with their business relationship. The last to leave had been brutally honest. "Richard, what we saw tonight tells us everything we need to know about your character and judgment. We can't be associated with that kind of behavior." Tony, the manager, approached Richard's table as the CEO sat staring at his untouched dessert. "Mr. Stone, your bill has been taken care of." Richard looked up in confusion. "Taken care of by whom?" "By the young man you confronted earlier. Mr. Martinez insisted on paying for your entire table." Tony's voice was carefully neutral, but Richard could hear the judgment underneath. The gesture hit Richard harder than any insult could have. Alex had just paid for the dinner of the man who had tried to humiliate him publicly. It was an act of grace that made Richard's own behavior look even more petty and cruel by comparison. As Alex and Rosa finally left the restaurant, phones across the dining room were lighting up with notifications. The videos people had taken were already being uploaded to social media, shared with friends and family, posted on various platforms. Within an hour, the hashtag #PianoKid was trending on Twitter. By the time Alex and Rosa reached their small apartment, the videos had been viewed thousands of times. Comments poured in from around the world, praising Alex's talent and condemning Richard's behavior. Professional musicians shared the videos, adding their own commentary about Alex's extraordinary performance. "Alex, you need to see this," Rosa said, looking at her phone as they sat in their tiny kitchen. "People are calling you a hero." Alex looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm not a hero, Tia Rosa. I just played some music." "You did more than that, Mio," Rosa said, scrolling through the comments. "Look at what people are saying." "You're inspiring them. You're showing them that talent and character matter more than money or status." Meanwhile, across the city in his penthouse apartment, Richard Stone was discovering the true power of social media. The videos from the restaurant had been viewed millions of times now, and the comments section was a nightmare of criticism and condemnation. His company's social media Accounts were being flooded with messages demanding his resignation. The morning news shows picked up the story, interviewing music experts about Alex's performance and social commentators about the broader implications of what had happened. "This young man showed us what real class looks like," said one commentator. "He responded to cruelty with art, to hatred with beauty." Richard's phone rang constantly as reporters sought comments as board members demanded explanations as business partners expressed their concerns. His assistant had stopped taking calls, overwhelmed by the volume of negative responses. By noon the following day, Nextech Solutions' stock price had dropped 15%. Major clients were calling to reassess their relationships with the company. Richard's own board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss his future with the company he had built, but the real consequences for Richard weren't financial. They were personal. Friends stopped returning his calls. Invitations to social events dried up. The exclusive clubs and restaurants where he'd been a welcomed guest suddenly seemed less welcoming. Richard discovered that reputation, once lost, was almost impossible to rebuild. Alex, meanwhile, was struggling with his newfound fame. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with offers and opportunities. Record labels wanted to sign him. Concert halls wanted to book him. Television shows wanted to interview him. It was overwhelming for a 16-year-old who just wanted to focus on his music and help his family. "I don't know what to do with all this attention," Alex confided to his music teacher at school. "I just want to keep studying, keep improving." "That's exactly the right attitude," his teacher replied. "Don't let the noise distract you from what's important. Your music, your family, your education, the rest is just noise." 3 weeks after the incident at Bella Vista, Alex received a letter that changed everything. It was from the Vienna International Music Academy, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. They were offering him a full scholarship to their summer intensive program, an opportunity that typically went only to students who had already graduated from college. "This came because of what happened at the restaurant," Rosa said, reading the letter over Alex's shoulder. "All those people who saw you play, who shared the videos, who were inspired by your story. It opened doors." Alex nodded, but his expression was thoughtful rather than excited. "It's amazing, Tia Rosa, but I keep thinking about something. None of this would have happened if that man hadn't tried to embarrass me. In a weird way, his cruelty created all these opportunities." Rosa smiled at her nephew's wisdom. "That's the thing about good people, Mio. They can turn even bad situations into something positive. You took his hatred and turned it into music. You took his attempt to make you feel small and used it to show the world how big your heart really is." The Vienna program would be incredible for Alex's development as a musician. He would study with masters, perform in historic venues, and learn from some of the greatest teachers in the world. But perhaps more importantly, he would do it all with the knowledge that he had earned it not just through his talent, but through his character. Richard Stone, meanwhile, faced a very different future. The board of directors had voted to remove him as CEO, citing conduct unbecoming and damage to company reputation. He retained his shares in the company so he wouldn't be poor, but his days of commanding respect and wielding power were over. Some people might have felt sorry for Richard's fall from grace, but he had brought it entirely on himself. His assumption that he could judge and humiliate someone based on their appearance and social status had cost him everything he had worked to build. 6 months later, Alex performed his first solo concert at Carnegie Hall. The sold-out audience included many of the people who had witnessed that fateful night at Bella Vista. Rosa sat in the front row, wearing a dress Alex had bought her with his first performance fee. Before he played his final piece that night, Alex spoke to the audience. 6 months ago, someone tried to teach me that I didn't belong somewhere because of who I am and where I come from. Tonight, I want to thank that person, because he taught me something much more important. He taught me that we define where we belong, not by what others think of us, but by what we do with the gifts we've been given." The audience erupted in applause, and Alex sat down at the magnificent Steinway grand piano on the Carnegie Hall stage. As his fingers touched the keys, And the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the historic venue. Alex smiled. This was where he belonged. Not because of his talent alone, but because of his heart, his character, and his refusal to let anyone else's prejudice diminish his dreams. In the back of the hall, unnoticed by most, stood Tony from Bella Vista Restaurant. He had closed the restaurant early just to attend Alex's concert. As the beautiful music filled the air, Tony thought about that night 6 months ago and smiled. Sometimes, he reflected, the most beautiful things in life come from the ugliest moments, and sometimes one young person's grace under pressure can remind an entire world what really matters.